Hi, I'm Bill, and I'm the content creator for visionandprophecy.com. In this video, I want to present a systematic approach to piecing together the timeline of the Tribulation Period, which is a prophetic 7-year period of judgment on the earth that has been 2,000 years in the making. In this video, we'll explore what is the Tribulation Period. We'll break out each scripture and how it's applied to produce a structured Tribulation Period timeline. And in the end, I'll present a consolidated version of the timeline along with an overview. So first, let's establish what the Tribulation Period is. The Trib Period is the prophesied future 7-year period of intense suffering, divine judgment, and widespread chaos on earth. It's sometimes referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble, or the 70th week of Daniel. The Trib Period comes from a direct, literal interpretation of biblical texts. At the end of this prophetic period, it's believed that Jesus Christ will return to the earth with his heavenly forces and battle Satan and his forces in the Battle of Armageddon. Then, Jesus will judge those on the earth and establish a heavenly kingdom on earth for 1,000 years. The place to start when talking about the tribulation period is Daniel 9. In this chapter, Daniel the prophet receives information directly from the angel Gabriel. In Daniel 9:24, Gabriel explains that God has established specific timing regarding all that needs done with mankind: atonement and justice regarding sin and evil, fulfilling all legitimate vision and prophecy, and establishing everlasting righteousness in the most holy place. Verse 24 says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish the wrongdoing, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important this particular verse is. If I had to pick a single verse in the Bible to explain what it is that God has been up to since creation, this would be it. You can see that the ultimate goal for God has been and is to establish a state of existence that is fully righteous and most holy. He's been aiming for existence with mankind with no more potential for evil or sin or death. And evidently, the best way to do that is to create man with free will, to sin, to learn, and to choose. Then, God provided a means of reconciliation unto him so that justice didn't result in destruction of the creation he loved and desired to dwell directly with. Now, what is left is a short time still available for individuals in creation to make their choice, followed by fulfillment of remaining prophecy, and then God's creation steps into its final form. He's been fashioning this final form for around 6,000 years now. I also need to point out that the time frame that's communicated here is 70 weeks. This word weeks is the plural form of the Hebrew word Shabuah, which is defined as a time period of 7. It works like the word dozen in English, except it's specific to time, and obviously it's 7 instead of 12. But it can refer to 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 months, or 7 years, any 7 period of time. We get a hint that the context is years when we read verse 1 and 2 of this chapter, but the fulfillment of this prophecy is confirmed for us in hindsight in the historical record, which I'll show you in a moment. Moving on to verse 25, it says, "So you are to know and understand that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with streets and moat, even in times of distress." Now notice that the start of the count is the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. And we're told that from that decree to the Messiah will be 69 of the 70 weeks of years. And we see this play out exactly as the prophecy says in history. You see, the decree that Gabriel spoke of was the decree from King Artaxerxes in the 20th year of his reign. And this is recorded in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 10, and it's reliably dated in extra-biblical records to have happened in 445 BC. When we look at Ezra chapter 4 through 6 and John 2 verse 20 and the historical account, we come to understand that the reason the 69 weeks were broken into 7 and 62 is that the first 7 weeks of years, or 49 years total, is the period that it took for the city and temple to be rebuilt. The remaining 62 weeks, or 434 years, was the wait from the city being finished to the arrival of Jesus in Jerusalem for his Passion Week. With the advantage of historical hindsight, we find that the number of days between the decree and Jesus' arrival was 173,880 days. This also is one of a couple ways to arrive at a time measurement that's known as prophetic years. If we take 173,880 days that happened in history and we divide it by the 69 weeks and then divide it by the 7 years in each of those weeks, we get an average of 360 days per year. So, a prophetic year is 360 days instead of 365 days as our calendar counts. In prophetic scripture, we get confirmation of this where there are multiple instances of half of a prophetic week of 7 years referred to as 1260 days, or as the phrase time, times, and half a time, which represents 3.5 years. With some quick math, we find that 1260 days divided by the 3.5 years gives an average of 30-day months. This, then applied to a full year, is 360 days rather than 365 days. There may be other significance for this, but we see it align with the fulfillment of the events in Daniel 9's prophecy in history. From March 14th of 445 BC, the decree, to the day of Jesus' triumphal entry in 32 AD on Nisan 10, we find that the prophecy that Gabriel provided to Daniel was pinpoint accurate when interpreted in light of the prophetic year that's supported by scripture elsewhere. Now, this is just the fulfillment of the first 69 weeks. So let's move now to talking about the 70th week of Daniel that's yet to come and how that is the origin of the idea of the tribulation week. Now, from this point to the end of the video, I will progressively build the tribulation period timeline by systematically stitching together relevant scriptures. First, continuing in Daniel 9, we see in verse 26 that it mentions Jesus being cut off with nothing, followed by the city and temple being destroyed. I highlight this verse to show that the Messiah Daniel 9 is talking about aligns with what happened to Jesus, and also to capture the first end-time relevant piece of the tribulation puzzle somewhat hidden at the end of this verse. It says that the end of the city will come with a flood, and that even to the end there will be war and desolations. You will see why later that capturing this end in a flood is relevant to the timeline, but for now I add it to the section at the bottom of the screen and will construct the timeline from there. The last thing to point out in this verse is that the subject being spoken of switches from the Messiah to a prince that is to come, whose people destroyed the city. This is relevant for interpreting the next verse. In verse 27, we see the final 70th week come into view, beginning with a covenant made by the prince who is to come with many for 1 week, or 7 years. In my previous video, I mentioned that we're still waiting for the 70th week to occur, and that the reason for the delay is actually the rejection of the Messiah. So keep in mind that we're talking about a 7-year period that hasn't happened yet. Then, in the middle of the 7 years, the prince will stop sacrifices and offerings of the Jewish people. This is an opportune moment to point out that this must mean that Jewish people have begun offering sacrifices and offerings again, since they haven't been doing sacrifices since the destruction of the city in 70 AD. On my website, I present some information in the Why 2025 page on recent developments that appear to indicate that Israel is in the process of reestablishing sacrifices in our present day. The last thing to point out in this verse is something that is worded a little strangely, that is commonly referred to as the Abomination of Desolation. This verse says that the prince will establish the covenant and stop sacrifices, but then one who makes desolate will arrive at that time and bring about a complete destruction that is decreed. I'll reveal who the one is that's arriving at this time in a later portion of this video. The last thing to notice here is that Gabriel uses the word gushes, alluding to the end coming with a flood that I highlighted earlier. So we get additional confirmation that the end comes with a flood. Now we move to Matthew 24, where Jesus is teaching as he and his disciples move from temple area in Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives. This teaching is called the Olivet Discourse, and in it we see Jesus prophesying of the end times, and he begins in verse 6 to tell the disciples what will come to pass after the city and temple are destroyed in 70 AD. He says that there will be wars and rumors of wars, but these are not the end. Then he goes on to say that nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and that all of these things are the beginning. The nation rising against nation and the kingdom against kingdom, the famines and the earthquakes, those mark the beginning. And he refers to them as birth pains. So it's here that Jesus tells us what is coming when the end begins: wars, famines, earthquakes. Now, these have been happening throughout the world for about 2,000 years since Jesus said these words, so it's not much to go on yet, but I mention it here and that in my next video I intend to highlight reasons why this time appears to be near, because the things that are mentioned here are escalating in frequency and intensity. But for now, let's continue. Later in the chapter, Jesus gives us our next timeline puzzle piece in verses 15 and 16, where he mentions the Abomination of Desolation, spoken of by Daniel, which will be standing in the holy place. This confirms for us not just that sacrifices will be happening prior to the Abomination of Desolation, but that the temple itself will be rebuilt by this time, the midpoint, in order for there to be a holy place for the Abomination of Desolation to be standing in. While I don't cover it in depth in this video, a description of the third temple can be found in Ezekiel 40 through 42. Next, we see in verse 16 that upon seeing the Abomination of Desolation, the people of Judea are told to flee to the mountains. And in verse 21, we learn that at that time it's referred to as Great Tribulation. Finally, in verses 29 and 30, we see that immediately following the tribulation of those days, the sun and the moon will be darkened, and the stars will fall from the sky, and then Jesus will return. Moving on to Revelation 11, we find a couple applicable things to our timeline. First, the chapter begins by mentioning the temple and the altar, and that there are people worshiping in it. This is a clue to the timing of the chapter being in the first half of the tribulation period. In verse 2 and 3, we get our first pieces of specific timing to apply to the 7-year period, where we find that the holy city will be trampled by the nations for 42 months, and authority will be given to 2 witnesses who will prophesy for 1,260 days. Because the temple and altar and worship within are mentioned, we can safely place these events prior to the Abomination of Desolation, which is associated with the end of sacrifices and offerings in the temple. We'll get confirmation of this further in the coming chapters. Moving on, I intentionally skip Revelation 12 for the moment and move to Revelation 13. The reason for this will become clear. For now, we're introduced to new characters in the tribulation period: the dragon and 2 beasts, a beast of the sea and a beast of the land. It's my goal to do another video on the identities of the beasts, but for now, just note that the beasts represent kingdoms and nations, and we'll get the identity of the dragon in the next chapter. For now, we see in verse 4 that the dragon is worshipped and gives his authority to the beast of the sea, and the beast is also worshipped. This appears to be giving more insight into the Abomination of Desolation, which we will get further confirmation on in a moment. In verse 5, the beast is blasphemous and is given authority to act for 42 months. He uses his authority to blaspheme God and his tabernacle, the temple. Continuing in Revelation 13, we see in verses 14 and 15 that the beast of the earth makes an image of the beast of the sea, which is some kind of symbology, like an icon or a statue, that even has the ability to speak, and the world is called to worship it or die. So I add the image of the beast occurring around the midpoint, likely in association with the abomination of desolation at the midpoint. The final thing to note in Revelation 13 for this study is back in verse 7. We learn that the beast of the sea makes war with the saints and overcomes them. This beast will have authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So the beast that we're talking about represents a world government. But for the timeline, I just note that it'll be making war with the saints because this becomes relevant in a later chapter. Now that we've covered Revelation 13, I want to backtrack to Revelation 12. This chapter is commonly passed over because it's viewed as very symbolic and therefore difficult to interpret. I skipped it for this reason, to first get some insight from Revelation 13. But we'll take it one piece at a time, and you'll see that it fits well with what we've constructed. Quickly, I'll mention that verses 1 through 4 indicate celestial signs that will be observed in the sky in relation to the tribulation period. I believe I've identified these, and I look to include them in a future video, hopefully the next one. Then, starting in verse 5, we find that the woman births a son. The woman here is symbolic of all God's people, also referred to as the kingdom of heaven or Zion elsewhere in the Bible. She births a son who is attributed with the same sort of prophetic description, which is ruling with a rod of iron, that we find in regard to Jesus in Psalm 2, verse 9. This son being born is not Jesus, however. Instead, we find in Revelation 2, verse 26 and 27 that Jesus promises to award the right to rule with a rod of iron alongside him to a portion of his church. So, we learn that the child being born in this chapter is not Jesus, but a portion of the church who is victorious and does the will of Jesus to the end. And it's this portion that is caught up to God and his throne. The word caught up in this verse is the Greek word harpazo, which is what is commonly referred to as the rapture. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to provide an overview of the rapture as well, but I will reveal at this time that Revelation 11, which we covered earlier, shows the first half of the tribulation period from the perspective of the earth, and Revelation 13 shows the second half of the tribulation period from the perspective of the earth. But Revelation 12, between these two chapters, actually zooms out and shows the entire timeline from the perspective of heaven. So this rapture verse belongs at the beginning of the timeline. Then, in verse 6, we see the woman flees to the wilderness, where she has a place prepared for her for 1,260 days. We place this before the abomination of desolation because this is the first of two references in this chapter to a half of the tribulation period. Next, in verses 7 and 8, we learn that sometime after the woman has fled for the 1,260 days, there is a war in heaven between Michael, the archangel, and his angels, against the dragon and his angels. Then in verse 9, we learn the identity of the dragon is actually Satan, and that he's thrown down to the earth. Now, we remember from Revelation 13 that the dragon is on the earth for the second half of tribulation, being worshipped and giving authority to the beast of the sea. It's in Revelation 12:9 that we see that he's expelled from the heavens and thrown down to the earth prior to giving his authority to the beast. This comes after the woman is in the wilderness, but before the events of the second half. So I place it in the midpoint, and it's at this point that I'll point out that the one who makes desolate, who comes at the midpoint that we recorded back in Daniel 9, seems to potentially be a reference to Satan himself, and that he'll be standing in the holy place. This starts to make the profaning of the holy place make much more sense in the light of Old Testament accounts of unconsecrated men who entered the Holy of Holies only to die when they entered it. Whether this would be a physical incarnation of Satan or someone possessed by him, we can't be sure, but I lean more toward the actual fallen angel himself in this instance. In Revelation 12, starting in verse 14, we find the other half of tribulation is now mentioned, when the woman is given wings to fly into the wilderness to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. These times add up to 3.5 times, a single, a plural, and a half. 3.5 times is the equivalent of 3.5 years, or half of the 7-year tribulation period. Since this follows the fall of Satan at the midpoint, we place it in the second half, and we see that the woman flees twice. She goes to the place to be nourished in the first half for 1260 days, and then again, the woman is seen fleeing, this time with wings, into the wilderness. Then, in verse 15, we get confirmation of the flood references. We found earlier these flood references in verses like Daniel 9. We see in verse 15 that the flood that occurs at the end is caused by Satan, the dragon serpent. So I've recorded this as a separate cell after the woman flees, in line with the flood reference that we found in Daniel 9. The last verse to mention for our timeline in Revelation 12 is found in verse 17. Here, we get indication that it's after the flood that the dragon, and presumably the beast of the sea that he's aligned with, go to make war with the rest of the people of God, the children of the woman. There's more to be done with this war indication, but we'll address it in a later chapter. For now, let's move on to Daniel 12. Here we find that Daniel is having a vision that starts in chapter 10, and in chapter 11, Daniel sees some events that have correlation to events that have happened in the past. And so it's possible that Daniel 11 is partially fulfilled, while it's also possible that, like other events, such as the events around the Maccabean Revolt, or other examples, that history may have a set of events that foreshadow something else that's coming. Regardless, in Daniel 11, verse 35, the prophecy switches to talking about the end times, and then the abomination of desolation is briefly mentioned in verses 36 through 39, and that leads into Daniel 12. And it's in Daniel 12 that we find additional pieces to the tribulation timeline puzzle that we're trying to put together here. In verse 7, we learn that the time required for the smashing of the power of the holy people will be a time, times, and half a time. It seems that this is the timeline leading up to the events mentioned in Revelation 11 and culminating in the ceasing of sacrifices and the profaning of the temple. So I place it in the first half of the tribulation. Then, in verse 11 and 12, we see that when the sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, a timeline period begins of 1290 days. This is a clear indicator that the 1290 begins at the midpoint, and I want to be clear that it's definitely not talking about 1290 days between the sacrifices ending and the abomination of desolation being set up. We know this when we look back at Daniel 9 verse 27, which tells us that both of these events happen at the midpoint. Note also that this 1290 days is 30 days longer than the 1260 days that we've previously encountered for the first half of tribulation, and I think that it's likely that the second flight of the woman for a time, times, and half a time is 1260 days, because we see a correlation of 1260 days and time, times, and half a time in the first half of the tribulation period. This also tells us that this 1290 days brings us to some other kind of an end. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit later on in the video, but for now, let's move on. We see in verse 12 that some kind of a blessing occurs at the end of the 1335 days from the abomination of desolation. So now we have some new questions to answer. What is the blessing that comes after the 1335 days, and what is the event that occurs 45 days prior to it? To answer these questions, we go to the end of Revelation. Beginning in Revelation 19, verse 7, we find that the bride has prepared herself for the marriage supper. This is a continuation of an analogy that Jesus uses throughout his ministry of the Galilean wedding customs, and I've covered this in some depth in my previous video. Now, we know from earlier that a portion of the church is raptured at the beginning of the tribulation period. I believe this portion is the bride of Christ, who spends the 7-year period in the heavens being consecrated as priests and prepared for the event of Jesus' second coming. So I apply Revelation 19 verse 7 to the top of the chart, and we move on to Revelation 19 verses 11 through 14. Here we find that Jesus' second coming is being described. It's in verse 14 that we see the bride clothed in clean white linen is coming with Jesus on white horses. And I want to note, they're not flying in on angels' wings. They're coming in on horses. It's my interpretation that this is the church clothed in the same righteousness Jesus is clothed in, which is represented by clean white linens. Examples of this can be found in Revelation 3, verses 5 and 6, as a reward to a portion of the church along with the right to walk with him, which is seemingly a reference to his second coming. We also find clean linen on Jesus in Daniel 10, where we match the description of the man Daniel describes to the description of Jesus in Revelation 1, verses 12 through 16, as well as his description here in Revelation 19, coming on the white horse. Finally, we also see the linens in burial preparations of Jesus' body that's recorded in John chapter 19, verse 40. So, the bride is clothed in the same way that Christ is clothed in life, in death, and in resurrected form. That being said, this interpretation is my own, and I'll look to provide a video in the future to help build out why I make this connection, but it would be very reasonable for someone to read this text and argue that the heavenly host coming with Jesus are just some other heavenly group that coincidentally is dressed in the same manner and for some reason is riding on horses. I just don't believe in coincidence. Moving on. In Revelation 19:19, we find the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembling to make war with the heavenly host. This war is called the War of Armageddon. We don't get much of a description of the battle here, as the very next verse indicates that the heavenly host win and judgments are poured out on the army of evil. So I add these points to the timeline. And here let me note that the preparations that the beast and the dragon make are happening before the second coming of Jesus and the War of Armageddon. Now, because we know from Revelation 13 that the dragon gives his authority to the beast and the beast makes war with the saints, and we know in Revelation 12 that the dragon seeks to make war with the children of Zion after the woman has flown to the wilderness, we can see that all of these things align. The preparations for war for the beast and the preparations for war of the dragon are the same because they're aligned with each other. Now, notice in the first half, before the Abomination of Desolation, we have a reference to 1260 days. And we have a reference for time, times, and half a time, and a 42-month reference. And they all overlap the same first half period of tribulation. This is the origin of the prophetic years that I mentioned earlier, and it seems to imply that the second flight of the woman for a time, times, and half a time, and the authority of the beast for 42 months are also likely both 3.5 years. However, because the end of the beast's authority is logically at the end of the green 1290 days at the second coming of Jesus, we find an implied gap of time between the Abomination of Desolation and the establishment of the beast's authority. That's not to say that the beast isn't around at the midpoint, but just that perhaps it hasn't been given its full authority yet. This potential will be significant in another video, hopefully my next video. But for now, just remember that there's a potential gap of time around 30 days prior to the beast being given his authority. The final 3 chapters of Revelation describe 3 major events that occur after the War of Armageddon. First, after the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus establishes his millennial kingdom on earth. This appears to be the blessing that Daniel 12 mentioned would come after the 1335 days. Meanwhile, starting at the end of the War of Armageddon, Satan is bound for 1,000 years to be released at the very end of the timeline for a final conflict and judgment. The last thing mentioned in Revelation is the perfect eternal state we were promised at the very beginning of this study. God performs a final judgment of all of mankind, and a new heaven and a new earth are established in an eternal state of righteousness in direct relationship with God, and without the need for the potential for evil or sin any longer. So now we've got all the pieces in their approximate positioning. Let's walk through it a final time with everything combined together. First, Matthew 24 mentions birth pains, which is followed by the woman, God's people, birthing a portion of the church that is raptured to heaven. This portion remains in heaven until the second coming of Jesus. This is the biblical support for the pre-tribulation rapture. Meanwhile, a 7-year peace treaty is established, and the first half of that treaty involves the Jewish people established enough to rebuild the Jewish temple and be practicing sacrifices and offerings, while there's otherwise trouble in Jerusalem, which includes 2 witnesses that are preaching the gospel to a hostile population of Jews and Gentiles. The Gentiles are allowed into the temple courtyard during this period, and the witnesses are ultimately killed, and the power of the Jews is apparently also dismantled, ultimately resulting in the sacrifices being stopped and the temple being profaned at the midpoint of the peace treaty by some form of idolatry. It seems that the profaning of the temple involves Satan himself, who was thrown from heaven to earth after a heavenly battle with the archangel Michael and his angels. The profaning of the temple prompts the woman, God's people, to flee as Satan gives his authority to a world government referred to as the beast of the sea. This beast demands to be worshipped under penalty of death and pursues God's people along with Satan, who refuse their worship. This culminates in the second coming of Jesus Christ with his heavenly host, who defeats the beast and Satan and binds them for 1,000 years. Jesus establishes a heavenly kingdom on earth at this time for 1,000 years that he's ruled alongside by his church, a nation of consecrated priests and resurrected martyrs. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released for a short time until God's final judgment is made on the entirety of the earth and everything in it. Then the current heavens and earth are replaced by a new heavens and earth that no longer have the potential for sin and death. At this point, the eternal righteous state of existence is established, God's ultimate goal of creation. Now, I realize the screen is completely filled with stuff in sort of an organized chaos at this point, so I've consolidated all the similarly timed events into a simplified form. The last thing I want to point out is that the entirety of this timeline is 2,595 days. We see 1,260 days from trib start to midpoint, then 1,290 days from midpoint to second coming of Jesus, and then 45 additional days from second coming to the beginning of the millennial reign. That's 2,550 days from the starting of the tribulation period to the return of Christ, and the total number of days is 2,595 days for the entire prophetic timeline, once it begins with the signing of the peace covenant. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this study helpful in understanding the different prophetic scriptures and how they fit together in a logical and literal way. This video lays the groundwork for my next video, which I'm excited to share regarding my justifications for my expected timing of these prophecies to finally occur. If this teaching blessed you, please consider subscribing or sharing this video with others, and join me as we continue to explore the amazing patterns of biblical prophecy and the hope of the second coming of Jesus Christ.